I've already ranked every track in Mario Kart 64, Wii and Double Dash, and the last one is quite a while ago, so it's about time we do the same for Mario Kart DS. As always, the list is based on how original, creative and fun the tracks are, and also my opinions on them. So without further ado, let's get started. 32. GameCube Baby Park. Take a track that was already really basic and remove everything that made it good. The DS had limitations, which make the retro tracks in Mario Kart DS quite underwhelming, and this track is the worst example of that. Baby Park was a very fun track in Double Dash because of its small size and the fact that there are constantly items bouncing around. But in this game, the track just feels completely dead. The track feels like it's way too big, and because of the fact there's no Bowser shells or anything exciting that can be thrown around the track, makes it feel way too boring than it should have been. I'm just glad it's only 5 laps in this version. 7 laps would have been way too much boredom. 31. Figure 8 Circuit. By far the worst circuit track in the series, Figure 8 Circuit has literally nothing to get hyped for. The track is, as the name suggests, a figure 8, but that's literally everything that this track is. There's not a single obstacle on this track, and since the layout is just a figure 8, there's a ton of straightaways that make the track very boring. This might even be the worst Mario Kart track ever, at least if you ignore Vanilla Lake, but that's besides the point. 30. SNES Choco Island 2. This track plays exactly like how it looks, like crap. But seriously, I'm not even joking. The track looks like freaking garbage and it plays exactly like garbage too. For some weird reason, the track is way too slippery, making this track a pain to play on. And if that wasn't already enough bullshit, later you have to drive across a giant pool of diarrhea and even across way too many ramps which you cannot trick off, literally defeating the entire purpose of them being there in the first place. This track is just miserable to drive on. 29. SNES Mario Circuit 1. The very first Mario Kart track ever made, recreated in Mario Kart DS. And since it's the very first Mario Kart track ever, and also from Super Mario Kart, the track is just really boring to drive on. And somehow this track also just looks really bad. Translating the 2D Mario Kart tracks into 3D really did not work out, and this track definitely shows that. At least it's not Choco Island 2, but man, this track is just blah. 28. Yoshi Falls. The visuals are pretty good, but everything else is lackluster. Yoshi Falls takes place in a valley with a huge Yoshi egg in the middle and waterfalls crossing your path. And while that sounds pretty cool, it would have been if the track itself wasn't just a glorified oval. And besides the waterfalls that you can also just avoid, there really isn't anything interesting going on. 27. SNES Donut Plains 1. It's yet another SNES track and really boring as a result. It even kind of bothers me why they picked the first version of Donut Plains when any of the other variants would have been much more interesting. Regardless, Donut Plains 1 really has nothing interesting to mention. The entire track is flat, the layout is simple, and the track even looks dull and washed out. This is really everything that you don't want from a retro track. 26. N64 Moo Moo Farm. Yet another beginner track. And look, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but the track selection in this game is making me do it. At least this one is not offensively bad since it's got some Monty Moles jumping from the ground, but then again you can completely avoid them by driving around them, which negates any challenge that they could have had. This track is just a bummer. 25. GameCube Luigi Circuit. Oh wow, yet again another beginner course. And then people say they love this game. And this one was unfortunately ruined in this remake. In Double Dash, this track was still somewhat interesting because the roads really felt interconnected. However, in this rendition, the roads are scaled up significantly, which not only removes that unique quality, but also makes a track last longer and makes it a lot more boring than it should have been. 24. GBA Bowser Castle 2. The definition of derpy track design, because oh boy, there's a lot of jumps which do absolutely nothing except screw up your kart's entire traction. And when I say there's a lot of them, I mean it, and it really drags this track down from being any fun at all. And not only is the track layout very disappointing, but everything else has just been ruined. The track looks horribly rendered, the music sounds like garbage, garbage and the aesthetics are just gone. At least the track isn't completely boring, but my god, it really isn't a good track at all. 23. GBA Peach Circuit. Okay, I promise this will be the final beginner track for now, and since I've already talked about a billion of these, or that's what it feels like at least, I guess I'll just say that the castle looks pretty cool. I don't know, that red hue somehow looks really unique. 22. GameCube Mushroom Bridge. Take a track from Double Dash and do the usual fuck up that this game loves to do. I was never really a fan of this track in the original, since the layout was really basic and the theme was quite boring, but at least it had some cool stuff to offer, like driving on the bridge, a couple of cool shortcuts, and some cool vehicles on the road. But literally every single one of those features were removed in this rendition, making this track as basic and boring as it can be. 21. SNES Koopa Beach 2. By far the best SNES track in the game, but still not that good. Not only because the other SNES tracks in this game are really bad, but also because, well, they're SNES tracks. The only gimmick this track has going for it is the tidal water, but it doesn't really affect the gameplay in any way. And for some reason, this rendition of the track actually looks worse than the original. The sand is a really dull and gray color, and the water looks terrible as well. Not a terrible track, but also not a great one. 20. GBA Luigi Circuit. By far the most interesting circuit visually, Luigi Circuit takes place during a rainstorm with a Luigi blimp in the background, and the rain effect really adds quite a bit to the race, leaving behind water puddles as a result. However, it's also another circuit track, and while the layout is more interesting than most circuits, the track is still very basic and pretty boring, also because there's no elevation of any sort. 19. Desert Hills. It's just your obligated desert track, and while it's nowhere near as bad as Dry Desert, it still really isn't great. Probably the most interesting aspect of this track is the fact that it has a pretty nice Mario Bros. 3 aesthetic going on with the multiple block structures and the pipes, but the rest of the track is nothing noteworthy. The layout is very basic, there's barely any obstacles to worry about, and some of the turns are ridiculously wide, which can make this track feel slow at times. 18. Cheap Beach. The name does not lie, it surely is a beach, but also a short boardwalk and a forest, and these changes in environments do somewhat help this track stand out from others, but not really that much if I'm being honest. The main thing that once again keeps this track from being even remotely more interesting though is just the extremely simple layout and lack of any exciting gimmicks going on. Besides the multi-environmental theme going on, there's not really anything this track has to offer. 17. DK Pass. Opinions on this track are mixed quite a bit. There's people that love it, others hate it, but I'm kind of in between. The track's theme is admittedly pretty weak. It just feels like a snowy mountain with a couple of turns here and there. The section with the snowballs is pretty cool, but the rest of the track is nothing really interesting. There's also a couple of snowmen to avoid, however they're released to avoid, so they don't really add a lot. It's not really a bad track, just quite forgettable in my opinion. 16. GameCube Yoshi Circuit. I'm really tired of talking about circuits in this game, but I guess this one is okay. I mean, compared to the GameCube version, it sucks, but at least it's still quite fun. By now you all know that the track is shaped like Yoshi, and that's pretty much the only saving grace this track has, because pretty much everything that was so cool about the original track has been downgraded or even completely removed. The piranha plants are no longer any threat, the shortcut in the tunnel is gone, and the track itself just looks dull. Plus, the much more basic mechanics in this game and the slower gameplay make it a lot less fun than in the original. 15. N64 Frappe Snowland. It's another N64 track, and therefore also pretty basic. The only really memorable thing about this track is the open area with a bunch of snowmen. Otherwise, it's not really the most interesting track to play on, since it just feels like a bunch of mild turns. At least the track looks pretty decent, but it's not really the most fun track to play on. 14. N64 Banshee Boardwalk. This has always been one of those overlooked tracks from Mario Kart 64, but I actually like it quite a bit. Don't get me wrong, this track isn't that good, but it's not bad either. It's pretty much just like Frappe Snowland, where there's only one section that's memorable, this time being the abandoned building with bats flying around. Otherwise, this track isn't exactly too exciting. 13. N64 Choco Mountain. Here's a track that a lot of people love, and I honestly don't really understand why. Just like the other N64 tracks I discussed, this one doesn't really have anything memorable to offer. I'd even say that the section that is the most memorable, being the one with the falling boulders, is less memorable than the ones from, say, Banshee Boardwalk. But in general, the entire track is more memorable due to its unique aesthetics. But that's pretty much the only thing that keeps this track from being bad. Even the boulders are easy to avoid. 12. Tick-Tock Clock. The theming is extremely unique, but my god, this track feels so dead. There's only so much a DS can handle, and this track really shows that, probably better than any other Nitro track. The track looks cheap, there's only a couple of releases to avoid obstacles, and the music sounds super quiet and even a bit cringeworthy. I mean, just look at the remake from Mario Kart 8. Now that's how you pull off this track correctly. It's not a bad track, but just averagely mediocre. 11. Delfino Square. For some reason, a lot of people love this track, and I honestly cannot see why. Delfino Square takes place in a town on an island inspired by Delfino Plaza, and while the setting is pretty chill, it's also because there's barely anything going on. There's not a single enemy to avoid, and only one bridge that rises and lowers occasionally to make it slightly more interesting. I guess it's kind of fun driving through the narrow alleyways, but otherwise this track is honestly pretty boring. 10. Wario Stadium. This track would have been a lot better if this game had tricks, but unfortunately Mario Kart DS's mechanics are pretty boring, leading to a track that's quite awkward to play. Wario Stadium has a lot of big jumps and relatively tight turns, but while those jumps might look cool, they're actually more of a negative because of the boring mechanics in this game, since you actually lose quite some speed by going off them, and the rest of the track is honestly nothing overly interesting. It's not that this track is bad, it just landed in the wrong game. 9. Rainbow Road. Rainbow Roads in Mario Kart games are usually really fun and difficult tracks, like the ones in Mario Kart Wii, 7, and 8, even though 7's is not particularly difficult. But the one in this game doesn't really deliver as much on both ends. The corkscrew and looping in the track are cool, but the rest of the track is honestly pretty forgettable. And it also doesn't help that the track borrows a lot of elements from the GameCube edition, making it feel very similar and making the track even more forgettable. 8. Waluigi Pinball. That's right, this overrated piece of mediocrity is not number 1 on my list, because holy shit, this track, while not bad, is so ridiculously overrated. Yes, the theme is amazing and the music is catchy, but the rest about this track is extremely underwhelming. Relatively boring layout and barely any obstacles to avoid apart from 2 measly pinballs, which is basically just luck whether they hit you or not. Most of the time you don't even get hit, so it's literally driving straight to the gutter doing absolutely nothing. And also, just because it's called Waluigi Pinball doesn't make it better. 7. Mario Circuit. The best circuit track in the game and also one of the better circuits in the franchise. It's quite strange seeing a Mario circuit in the Star Cup, but it actually makes sense after having played it since it's quite difficult for circuit standards. There's quite a few tight turns to master and obstacles to avoid, which makes it all the more fun. And while the setting is pretty lame, the layout is pretty decent. It's just a shame that this track is just ridiculously forgettable. 6. GBA Sky Garden. The best retro track in the game by far. Not only because it's the most pleasant retro track to drive on, but it's also the most pleasant retro track to look at. Mostly because most of the other ones look like garbage, but also because it just looks like heaven. What more could you ask for? Well, okay, a more interesting layout is one thing, but honestly, this is just the most comforting retro track to play, and there's a bunch of shortcuts, so what's there to complain about? 5. Bowser's Castle. Entering the top 5, we have the most forgettable 3 Bowser's Castle of them all, because pretty much the only things I remember from this track are the room with the spinning floor and the section with the spinning wheel. The rest of the track, while not bad, is just quite forgettable. And just a reminder, we're at number 5, which is quite worrying. And just like Rainbow Road, it borrows a lot of elements from the GameCube edition, which makes it stand out even less. It's still an enjoyable track, just nothing really memorable or special. 4. Luigi's Mansion. One of the classics from this game, and for pretty good reasons. A track based on Luigi's own ghost hunting franchise was a really good idea, and it's executed pretty well. You get to go inside the mansion for a bit, spawning scary paintings of Boos, as well as go outside avoiding walking trees. And while it's quite cool going inside the mansion, there's barely anything going on inside, and the outside section can be quite annoying due to large amounts of mud. It's a good track, but also maybe slightly overrated. 3. Shroom Ridge. An underrated track, but then again, everyone seems to say so is it really? Theories aside, Shroom Ridge is a very entertaining track, with a very cozy highway setting and a not so comfortable ride along cliffside. I honestly don't really know why this track is so overlooked and forgotten. Maybe it's because the setting is so unusual, but I honestly don't know what else it can really be. Regardless, it's a pretty fun track, and definitely pretty overlooked, especially if it wasn't for the Booster Course Pass. 2. Peach's Gardens. Who knew that the gardens of the princess herself were so dangerous? But it does make for a very entertaining track to drive on. And not only is it a fun track, but it represents our garden very well, with many hedges and flower beds to avoid or drive through, and a layout that really feels like a maze. And of course you gotta have some security in the garden, right? Well, say hello to the freaking chain chomps, these fellas do not mess around. Overall, it's a great time. And 1 is Airship Fortress. This won't really be a surprise to a lot of people. Airship Fortress has always been one of the most remarkable Mario Kart tracks of all time for many reasons. Taking place on the classic airships from Mario Bros. 3, featuring many different obstacles even as early as the starting line, and a crazy downwinding turn, this track has it all. And while it still isn't a god tier track, it is a really good one and definitely my favorite in the game. And that was it for this video. To be honest, after making this list, I noticed that Mario Kart DS doesn't really have a very strong course selection. A lot of these tracks, especially the retro ones, are just relatively basic and uninteresting and don't really stand out in any significant way. Anyway, let's just end off this video before getting too deep into this discussion. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and all that fancy stuff, and I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye!